Welcome to Behind the Album, where I'm going to reveal some of the astounding backstories that influenced some of the greatest albums. The conspiracies, the lies, the egos, the arguments, the grudges, the jealousies, the good bits. Every dirty secret you need to know about the albums you love. Disclaimer, though I have researched these albums and bands intensively, there are certain comments that I will make that are my assumptions and my assumptions only based on the aforesaid research. And so, we have the tragic tale of AC/DC's For Those About to Rock. This was the 8th studio album by the band. It was released at the end of November 1981 and reached number 3 in the UK and number 1 on US Billboard, making it the band's first number 1 in that country. The huge problem that lay in the recording of For Those About to Rock was the enormous success of its predecessor, Back in Black, and the shadow that cast. When Back in Black was released, it topped the UK charts, but insanely, and far more importantly, it spent more than 5 months on the US Billboard Top 10 and had currently sold around 5 million copies when the band went in to record the follow-up. So the obvious question is, how the hell do you do that? How do you better that? We'll see that the attendant psychological tsunami that hung on the coattails of these questions had a massively detrimental influence on the development of AC/DC's 8th album. So let's examine how this damage was spread out. To have a successful album, you need 4 things to be on the ball. 4 parts doing their jobs. The first is the record company, giving the record the right promotion. The second is management, giving the band the right support by keeping the machine well oiled. The third is the producer, delivering the right atmosphere and working conditions to get the best out of the band, and also obviously to deliver the best sound. And last, but by no means least, the band themselves have to be there with the material and the right attitude. But that last part, being right, is largely dependent on the first 3 parts being right. And let me assure you that it is no exaggeration to say that Atlantic Records manager Peter MENSCH and producer MUTT were an egotistical circus when AC/DC were attempting to record their 8th album. AC/DC as a band did, though, have one positive thing going for them, and that was AC/DC as a band. They alone were able to deal with the huge success generated by Back in Black. For the Young Brothers, its triumph was an affirmation that they were doing things right. A massive confidence booster. It's no coincidence that for the first time ever, AC/DC took a sustained break after touring Back in Black. And why not? They rightly believed that they deserved it. This confidence meant the Young Brothers had absolutely no trouble writing new material. In fact, For Those About to Rock was already written before they entered the studio. So for them, there was no pressure. And that attitude rubbed off on the rest of the band. As Brian Johnson said, quote, "We never felt any outside pressure because we didn't let it in. We were very confident after the success of Back in Black, and we had every right to be." End quote. Exactly. The famous AC/DC family motif breeding this insularity bubble. The band were confident, self-reliant, and totally resolute in preparing to record the following album. Unfortunately, nobody else was. Let's start with the record company. Atlantic Records, they had been used to having the biggest heavy rock act in the world on their roster, Led Zeppelin. And now, wonder of wonders, they suddenly had the next biggest heavy rock act in the world on their roster. Who would have thought it? Well, not new President Doug Morris, who reacted to this wondrous phenomenon with an act of unbelievable crassness. Blinded by and desperate to cash in on the success of Back in Black ASAP, he decided not to wait for the next album, but to release the as yet unreleased in the States Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, AC/DC's 1976 offering. A 5-year-old album, in no way comparable to what the band were doing now, and of course featuring a completely different singer. What he'd effectively done was sabotage the momentum, hijack the expectation for Those About to Rock by sliding out irrelevant and confusing material. But Dirty Deeds went straight to number 3 on US Billboard and shifted millions. Actually, outselling For Those About to Rock when that was finally released. In fact, on the tour promoting For Those About to Rock, AC/DC were actually forced to add significant amounts of material from Dirty Deeds to their set list, thereby further detracting focus away from the new material. Vice President of Atlantic Records, Phil Carson, commented on the Dirty Deeds release as, quote, "God knows how many albums For Those About to Rock would have sold had Doug Morris, president, simply waited for that to come out." End quote. How could you undermine AC/DC and Brian Johnston especially anymore if you tried? It was an incredibly short-sighted act with long-term ramifications. The Young Brothers were predictably furious, but could do absolutely nothing about it. It was reputed that upon hearing the news, Angus Young spent 2 days wiping down the studio walls after Malcolm's head exploded. So, record company, no stars. Now for the production. Well, for a start, for some reason, the band were recording the new album in unknown studios in Paris. No one appears to really know why. The record company, when questioned, put out some vague blurb that they were recording in Paris because, and I quote, of their desire to create a new album that could match the cultural impact of their previous work. End quote. Well, I'm sure the young brothers were totally on board with that. Rehearsals didn't go well, and they didn't go well because of one man, MUTT Langer. Once a saviour, now a problem. Unlike the band, I believe Langer could not get his head around the phenomenal success of Back in Black. The man's perfectionism, which had been a massive asset before, now became an awful drawback. Always striving for perfection, on Back in Black, the sales seemed to indicate that he'd found it. Now what the hell was he supposed to do? How could he sustain, let alone improve on that? I believe Langer's confidence was shot before he even entered the studio, and his actions do seem to support this. Langer spent the first 3 days trying to find the right snare sound and failing. After a week, he eventually blamed the studio for his lack of success and hauled a frustrated band and possibly a half-crazed Phil Rudd off to another Parisian studio. And then when he didn't like that one, he hauled them all off to another Parisian studio. And then when he didn't, you get the picture. After weeks spent trying a variety of studios that Langer never actually stayed in for more than a couple of days, they ironically ended up back in, yes, the original studio. And this was not a studio that the young brothers were particularly enamoured of. But what they were far less happy about was a producer second-guessing every decision he couldn't make. They had the songs. All they wanted to do was record them. Malcolm Young especially was becoming extremely frustrated. In part, I think, because he could see exactly where Langer was going wrong. When talking about the situation in retrospect, Malcolm Young said that Langer was, and I quote, trying to outdo Back in Black for sound, whereas we were more thinking of the music, end quote. Malcolm Young believed that Langer's dithering was draining the spirit and energy from the band, and therefore from the record. Another Malcolm Young quote. It took us forever to make that record, and it sounds like it. It's full of bits and pieces, and it doesn't flow. End quote. Well, there's obviously no sympathy here for Mutt Langer's musical PTSD, which it was rumoured had extended far outside the recording process and had led Langer to questioning every aspect of the band's operation. Now, of course, what we do know is that it doesn't pay to piss Malcolm Young off, because there is only one outcome. And couple that to the huge amounts of money that they were paying Langer to, I quote, fanny about, Malcolm's words. After this record, Mutt Langer was gone. So producer, no points. And now, on to the manager. Peter MENSCH was quite a recent addition to the AC/DC machine. And at first, he was 24 hours hands-on. Nothing was too much trouble. Every problem foreseen and catered for. But the success of Back in Black meant that MENSCH was suddenly managing the biggest heavy rock band in the world. So far from looking after the biggest heavy rock band in the world, he used the prestige and stature this gave him to largely ignore the biggest heavy rock band in the world and chase other bands, because more management, more money, more prestige. MENSCH didn't just drop the ball, he threw it in a corner and stamped on it. And it didn't go unnoticed by Malcolm Young. The Young brothers themselves felt isolated and undervalued by MENSCH, especially during their trials and recording tribulations with Mutt Lange. Not once had MENSCH tried to intervene and help the situation. In fact, AC/DC, when recording For Those About to Rock, hardly ever saw MENSCH at all. Matters came to a head when the band had to halt recording to play the biggest gig of their lives, headlining 1981 Monsters of Rock. At the time, this was literally the last thing they wanted to do. They felt compromised by the entire recording process and felt themselves to be surrounded by highly paid so-called professionals not doing their jobs. And it came back to bite them. As they were literally, and I mean literally, going on stage at Donington, Malcolm Young, yes, it had to be him, was actually stopped by a security guard because Malcolm hadn't been issued with the right security pass. That basic lack of organisation, almost amounting to disinterest, was the final straw. MENSCH's days were numbered. Manager, no points. But somehow, we still have this great record. There's no filler on this album, but admittedly very little out and out killer, apart from the title track. I believe For Those About to Rock has a great production, especially the drums, whatever the trials and tribulations that went into it. The songs themselves are well paced and structured, and on occasion rather uncluttered for AC/DC. And this transparency allows the bluesier element of the band to come through. I don't think it is a conservative album, which is a claim that has been levelled by some critics. For me, it exudes confidence. Above all, it is an assured album. Now it has to be said that in retrospect, the Young brothers felt that For Those About to Rock was just too polished and maybe even too commercial. I believe they're wrong about this, but I can understand why they came to that conclusion because of the tortuous process of its construction. And surely it's no coincidence that next album, Flick of the Switch, was produced by the brothers themselves in a very back to basic, raw fashion, reminiscent of much earlier times, and sold like it. But that's another story. Rolling Stone magazine claimed that For Those About to Rock was AC/DC's best album. It isn't. But it's their last genuinely accomplished work for a while. And out of the 17 record back catalogue, I would therefore place For Those About to Rock as high as number 5. Well, I hope you've been entertained. I hope you've been informed. Please leave a comment, smash a like and subscribe, because all these things help me with my bowel movements. Till the next time.